Welcome to the third webinar for this year's Sustainable Cities course. Today we will listen and interact with Aromar Revi. Aro is the director of IHS and has been a senior advisor to various ministries of Government of India, consulted with a wide range of multilateral, bilateral development and private sector institutions. He also works on economic, environmental and social change at various scales. Today, we'll start this webinar by listening to Aro for about 20 minutes. And in the meanwhile, please write in your thoughts, comments, and questions in the chat box. Dear learners, another important information that we'd like to talk about is this year, due to change in platform and accompanying technical glitches, we may face issues during the streaming of this webinar. If you do experience such issues with audio or video of this webinar, please do let us know in the chat box. We shall try our best to fix it. In the event that the issues are not resolved, please do write in your questions in the chat box and we will have Aro answer them, and we shall post the video on the platform under the weekly webinar tab. Let's hope this one goes without any glitches. Over to you, Aro.
Good. I hope we're able to talk freely, and sorry for having missed the earlier sessions. I've been traveling a bit, but welcome, and it's really nice to have all of you on this. We can hopefully pick up an interesting conversation on questions of economic development, on questions of migration, on questions of how we deal with wealth and inequality, which are really critical even when we were negotiating the SDGs, but are becoming marked at the current point of time. So in about 3 weeks' time, most of the key urban leaders in the world will be meeting in Durban at the UCLG. You will find out what UCLG is a little later in this course, but UCLG is basically the confederation of all local governments across the world. They'll be meeting for a week to try and get a sense of how we should move forward across the globe in dealing with critical questions, of which questions of economic development, especially livelihoods, is a central issue. This is, of course, not an issue only for mayors who will be there and a whole range of us who help support action at the local level, but also national governments. And the reason for that, I guess, is fairly simple. As we've seen over the last few weeks, cities in some senses are the key drivers, or urbanization is a key driver of economic development over well over a century. And this has accelerated significantly in the last 30 or 40 years, and much more so since the 1970s and 80s. You know the numbers just now. You've been through some of the sessions that I've done with you earlier. But the key thing is cities not only concentrate people, but they concentrate economic opportunity. And how do they do that? They do that through the action of economies of scale, and increasingly in a network-based world, in a world in which the gig economy is becoming important in some areas, through economies of scope. It's bringing together of people, making sure that infrastructure is there, and other economic opportunities that tie them together, that give city this tremendous sort of fillip. And in some senses, if you look at the world economy at the current point of time, and we're facing a whole range of critical challenges, starting first in 2008 with the economic crisis that started in, let's say, the housing sector in the United States, percolated into the US economy, especially the major financial institutions, then became a serious question in Europe. These are two regions of the world which were considered to be the most stable, even during the periods of crisis that we saw in the 70s, the sort of Cold War era that persisted till the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. But we found that in some senses, growth stalled. Unemployment was a very significant issue. And if you visited, and some of you come from cities in these regions, you could feel a palpable change in a whole range of things, in availability of basic services, but in the levels of unemployment, especially youth unemployment. Simultaneously, we've seen over the last, let's say, 2.5 decades or so, the expansion of Asia, and specifically East Asian cities. It first started in Japan, then expanded to countries like South Korea, and some of the other so-called Asian tigers like Thailand and Indonesia. But the key driver of this process has been the process of urbanization in China. And China has really shown us in some ways what the power of rapid urbanization and the power of agglomeration economies can actually do. Of course, there are many challenges that come with this. including the primary challenge of inequality. And inequality is something that's really becoming a serious issue in many parts of the world, starting, of course, with Latin America. Latin America hosts some of the most unequal countries in the world. Brazil has gone through a series of crises on this question. It's going through, I would say, deep political changes. Those of you who've been following the news, Santiago and Hong Kong, in some senses, are archetypical at the moment of the core challenges that we're having in urban areas in many parts of the world. And many of us were meant to be in Santiago in early December for the COP, for the Conference of Parties on Climate Change. And the government has just announced that they're not going to be hosting another summit of economic development, which is meant to be happening in the near future. And also the COP will have to move somewhere else. So I guess the question that's troubling us in many parts of the world is how, for example, Santiago is in Chile. Chile is one of the better countries in the world. It's, in fact, it ranks above the United States in the Sustainable Development Index. And Santiago, in some ways, is one of the most economically vibrant cities in Latin America after many decades of a whole range of political and other crises. Why is it that cities like this, which are relatively affluent, that have been doing relatively well for some time, why do they have these economic crises? And I think the question of inequality and the question of access, especially for a whole range of people who are either recent migrants into the favelas of many parts of Latin America and also into the slums of Southeast Asia, of South Asia. The challenge is that people are coming in and expecting a number of things. They're expecting jobs, they're expecting employment opportunities. The global economy is changing, and as we concentrate inequality and wealth concentrates, with a certain set of people, including in urban areas, you find that a whole range of people are, in a sense, being pushed out of economic opportunity, which is a real driver of migration to cities. We've talked about the question of rural to urban migration, urban to urban migration. These things are becoming increasingly disrupted in many parts of the world, largely by economic forces, largely by a process of exclusionary urbanization, which is tied to a few things that we've got some sense of. One, of course, is how we plan our cities. Are they planned to be able to provide opportunities for people to come in and find places to work, to be able to educate their children, to be able to participate in city life? There's been a whole movement for the last many decades about the right to housing and the right to the city, which essentially means that anybody can come and live wherever they would like to, but from the point of view of an earlier frame of urbanization, where you would try and contain urban growth, where you would try and contain migration, you try and exclude migrants from the urban fabric. We still have a significant way to go. It's part of a particular mindset of economic development and planning. And of course, in some countries, notably China, there have been a systematic system. We've talked about the hukou, which is now slowly being watered down and changing. There are many changes that are happening in China, but for almost 3 decades or so, that was the governing principle. If you lived in a rural area, you had a rural hukou. If you lived in an urban area, in some senses, and this was before the big changes of the 1990s, you had an urban hukou, and maybe you were not so different. There were some advantages of being in urban areas, and people couldn't move from one category to the other, or if they did, they moved as migrants. They often didn't have rights. Their children have to go to schools which were often inadequate. Many people lived in really difficult circumstances, families being separated, women and men living in different areas. I've seen some of that in China over the late 1990s, early 2000s, but that's changing just now. And I think what is becoming increasingly accepted in many parts of the world, even though it's a serious challenge. If you're a mayor of a city and you find, either through natural processes within quotes or otherwise you have 500,000 people coming into your city, how do you actually manage that? But I think we're trying to sort of enable this change in discourse, change in understanding, which basically says that people who come to the city are actually citizens like everybody else, but they contribute critically to its functioning. So in some senses, the poor in the world, the vulnerable in the world, are subsidizing the world of the rich, of the gated communities, and a whole range of, of the rest of us who, in some senses, are privileged because of the living conditions they work in, because of the fact that there's insecurity in terms of jobs and labor. We heard from Rinana Jhabwala about Seva and what Seva has tried to do in many parts of India. It's one of the largest women's trade unions in this part of the world and pretty much anywhere. And of course, what people have done in terms of economic development in other locations. So while cities give people the opportunity, they also have the ability, and this is not new, of not only concentrating opportunity of job creation, of access to infrastructure, of better living conditions, but also concentrating poverty. And as inequality grows, a whole range of other forms of vulnerability that come with it, gender and other forms of discrimination, a whole range of questions of insecurity. And as we have regimes in some countries who actually see people as interlopers, there's active processes of pushing them out, of evictions, of forced evictions of very large scale, often for things like mega projects and large development activities, which disproportionately help people who have resources and access, and a form of development which is now being questioned quite considerably. And the whole idea of sustainable cities is that you're able to balance the economic, the social, and ecological questions. And centrally, if you don't address economic questions, and you address them at multiple levels, from questions of local economic development, informality is the most significant form of economic activity and process in the global south. And as urbanization expands in the global south, that's going to be the most important way that people have to earn their livelihoods. And we're not talking about a few 100 million people. We're talking about a few billion people here as urbanization spreads into sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of South Asia. And of course, we'll see some of the challenges that have been a big issue in Latin America, sort of having to be dealt with. So when we look at questions of informality, we have to try and understand that there are linkages within, of course, the local economy, but also the laws and practices that we sort of engage with as we try and build better and better cities. And part of this challenge, of course, is the imaginary in some ways. So if every city wants to become like a Singapore or a Dubai in the global south, we have a serious challenge, because many of these cities are better than the countryside in the countries in which they exist. Many of those countries, even if they're low middle income countries like India, have a per capita income of under $2,000 per capita. The city dwellers actually may have a higher per capita income, but you're trying to compare them, and you're trying to set an aspiration of places that are at 10 times that per capita income. So the journey from here to there means tremendous amount of economic growth. But if that economic growth comes along with dramatic increases in inequality, because the way the economy is structured, the way the property relations are structured, etc., you have a serious challenge, because the difference between the haves and the have-nots increases. That leads to abysmal living conditions, in some cases, increased poverty and a lack of access. And obviously, in a world that's connected, where even in a country like India, you have 500 million people with smartphones, there will be some contest. In fact, it's rather surprising that the contest doesn't become even more sort of radical than it currently is. And when you concentrate contests in cities, then you have a whole range of instabilities as far as that's concerned. So the question of economic development, the question of how one addresses the creation of employment opportunities, whether it's self-employed or otherwise, for 60 million young people a year across the world is a very, very critical question. And obviously, it will not come in all industries everywhere, but people need basic things like water and sanitation and basic goods and services. And we have to restructure our economies to enable people who don't necessarily have a full set of skills, which a well-connected, well-educated, and more capitalized economy would actually provide. So I think we have some interesting opportunities here. Some countries have done much better than others. And of course, as we look at the landscape across the world, we find some dramatic shifts that have taken place over the last 20 or 30 years, in particular regions of the world, especially, like I said, in East Asia, where this tremendous transition has taken place of urbanization, reduction of poverty, but of course, with its sort of, other difficult outcomes, serious environmental challenges, traffic and congestion, certain amounts of social unrest as economic structures change, and skills and jobs are not able to catch up with each other, and of course globalization, which is now in deep contest, especially because of the trade conflicts that we see emerging between different blocs, and especially between the United States and China, which is going to affect us in many parts of the world. So some countries and some cities will find great opportunity in doing that, and others will be somewhat left behind. The other thing that I'd like to, there is, let's say, there is a particular view of the world that views cities like just like firms, like companies. So in a world in which there's competition, that's the way, in a sense, that a market-based discourse is organized. The idea is that firms compete with each other. The ones that better uh, are better situated to be able to address consumer needs, or to be more successful, survive, and the other ones die. So it's survival of the fittest, and that kind of frame has been used for urban areas, and that's become a discourse in some senses. But I think the evidence points to the fact that cities actually cooperate much better than firms do, and in some senses, they don't compete effectively, like sort of like firms do. So we are seeing a lot of cooperation just now, a lot of sharing of lessons, especially as we try and build this new economy that is decarbonized, that is more accessible, that is more inclusive than what we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years. And this is actually happening, and hopefully will happen rather quickly over the next 10 to 15 or 20 years, because we have to address the question of employment and livelihoods and equality at the same time as we address questions of environmental justice, and of course the existential challenges of climate change, deforestation, what we're doing to our oceans. They're all tied together, and especially for cities along the coast, these questions are most palpable, because that's where you see the impact of hurricanes and cyclones. That's where you see flooding taking place in many parts of the world, whether it's Bangkok at one end, or you to look at New York, or other cities in the Philippines. So there are multiple examples that you're seeing across the world where these cities, which are in a sense have been drivers of the economy of their countries and of regional development, are increasingly at risk because of the feedback between the economic development and the success that we've created in some senses for some people and their impacts on the environment. And of course, like we've said earlier, and you will explore further, social development is a very critical question. If you're not able to educate and provide adequate healthcare for our people in urban areas, when you have the infrastructure, you have the technology, you have the institutions to do it, then we are in some trouble. And it's not only the large metropolitan cities that are important here. It's really making available these basic things, what the SDGs talk about, dealing with poverty, SDG 1, dealing with hunger, SDG 2, dealing with health and education, SDGs 3 and 4. These are the core things that we have been able to do quite successfully in some parts of the world, but we need to do for everybody everywhere, because that is what the universal agenda is all about. That is what we talk about when we're talking about all the SDGs, because it's not only SDG 11, which is on sustainable cities and communities. It's all of those things that make life sort of worth living in some senses. That's what brings people to cities. And we cannot, in some senses, as people who are engaged as professionals, as people who manage cities as urban managers, as people who govern them as elected representatives, or as people who are trying to put things together, we really cannot let people down this time. Urbanization has been around for a long time, and we've had serious challenges with them. Many cultures have actually sort of fallen apart on questions of sustainable urbanization in the past. We have a long history of that. But in this century, and I would say in the next 20 or 30 years, we have to get it right, because it's an existential challenge for us. We have a population of 5 billion people in cities pretty soon, which is maybe 4 or 5 times what it was 100 years ago. So if we continue to make mistakes of the 20th century, I think we would be in serious, serious challenges. And cities, in that sense, will provide us the opportunity for innovation, the opportunity to try and bring together people, around collective action to try and address these questions in a systematic, organized way, and most important, in an equitable and accessible manner. Because, in a sense, all the great social revolutions that we've seen in the last 150, 200 years have also been launched in cities, whether it's the end of slavery, the beginning of, emancipation of women, which is still an ongoing project. Patriarchy is well alive and kicking in many parts of the world, addressing questions of caste, community, and ethnicity. These are questions that have really been, they've been contested in cities, and as cities change, and as they actually show us the way forward, we find national governments changing. And of course, you have things which are now in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the UN of 1948 and the SDGs just now, which are the common political consensus of leaving no one behind, leaving no place behind, which is what sustainable urbanization is around, and leaving no ecosystem behind, because without the ecosystems, neither society nor the economy nor, of course, the places that we live in are going to survive very long. And there are big, big challenges there. So I'll stop now, and let's hope we can have this conversation, and we can spend the next 30-40 minutes trying to get to grips with the questions that you have, and hopefully I'll be able to trying to respond to them as they come.
Right. Thank you so much, Aro. We have a lot of questions on the discussion forum and also on the live chat, so I'll quickly dive into them. First question is from Neha, and she's questioning. Her question arises from what you just spoke about, and she asks how to address or work at the level of the imaginary that you just mentioned. And I'll club that with Saili, who's asking you, can you stress on what you mean by the level of imaginary?
So, urbanization is a new thing in many parts of the world. Of course, in Europe and North America, more recently, you've had high levels of urbanization for 100 or 150 years. In many parts of the world, in a generation, like, for example, let's take the case of China. China, is adding 15 million people a year for 20 years. 300 million people come into urbanization from a very different agrarian culture with a whole range of challenges. So the question then is, what kind of urban future do you see? And I think the classic example, and I've used it earlier in one of your sessions, is the image of Shanghai. When Shanghai, when it was, and if you see the Pudong side of Shanghai, or even more dramatically, if you go and look at what's happening in the Pearl River Delta, those areas 25 years ago were rice fields. So what do you actually bring and create in the rice fields? How do you conceive of how a Shenzhen were created is the question that says. So there are certain ideas that have become quite strong. And this is a debate that I have with many Chinese colleagues. And I said, look, you have taken some of the worst of let's say, North American urbanism, and tried to apply it in a very different circumstance. Shanghai itself has many more skyscrapers than you would actually see in New York. And if you're in New York maybe 100 years ago, 70 or 80 years ago, New York in some senses was a shock to people coming from Paris. So this process of transformation also comes from our ideas of what kind of an urban future do you want. So that I've given you a sense of form, but if you look at it in terms of equality and access, a city that provides all of its citizens access to basic services looks very different from one in which only the market works and some people have to survive and some people have to struggle. So if you look at the classic examples of Rio, and people have used them and again, you see the hillsides of Rio, and I've been in and visited and spent days in the favelas there, and then you see very close, or maybe half a kilometer away, some of the most expensive real estate in Latin America, maybe in all of the Americas, sitting cheek by jowl. So I think we really have to, and this is because of a way that many of us, especially leaders in different parts of the world, would like to see development proceed. Now, in actual practice, it's very messy, it's very complicated. And Singapore, for example, has started as a fantastic example. I was there just 10 days ago, and they have transformed their island state from a very messy place with lots of slums, inequality, a whole range of other things, into a model, country or city state at the current point in time. So they've done remarkable things, but the challenge is you cannot replicate Singapore in other contexts, even in small islands places. So if you take Singapore and try and apply that idea to Fiji, or you take it to the Maldives, it's completely unworkable in some ways. And if you try and take that frame and apply it to a large environment like a large country like India, and try and take Mumbai and try and make it Singapore or make it Shanghai, it doesn't work. We have to look at our context very carefully, and we have to understand the political economy of how they actually work themselves out. So questioning these imaginaries, I think, is very important. I think there's a big debate in Africa at the moment about these great world class cities that some countries are trying to emulate and replicate. Actually, what we found in many parts of the world is they make things more difficult because they concentrate wealth, they concentrate infrastructure, they concentrate a whole range of processes in particular places. It is good for some of the international investors to come in, but if you look at the actual fabric of the city, if you look at the long-term processes, sometimes they actually heighten inequality, they make things very difficult, and they cease to be sustainable. Because remember, sustainability is not only about having glitzy fancy buildings and things that look very good for people who come from the outside. It is the everyday life of people that becomes very critical.
Right. Our next question is from Udit, and he says Chile is credited for its free market policies, which led to its meteoric rise towards a developed nation. Considering the situation there, through David Harvey's essay of The Right to the City, would you say the current uprising is a reaction to capitalist driven urbanization? If so, what corrections can be done to address the asymmetry of access to land, services, opportunities in countries like Chile?
This is a very real. I'm glad you raised the question. Of course, David Harvey has sort of laid out the one of the theoretical foundations, one of the ways of interrogating this question. But there's an interesting piece that I think Jeffrey Sachs wrote a few days ago on the potential connections between what's happening in Chile and what's happening in, let's say, Hong Kong. I mean, Hong Kong is also a very well endowed city. It's a high per capita income city, etc., etc., etc. So there is one school of thought, and the reason that I'm being a little cautious about it is that we don't really know the exact reasons for this, and I guess you need more research and more engagement on this. But the fact is that when you start providing a set of people, whether it's in a city or otherwise, with things which other people don't have access to, and a very effective way of doing that is through land markets, and you completely open up land markets to not only a domestic economy or domestic competition, but also to international processes, because that's what brings in investors. That's what, in a sense, fuels real estate. And you do that at a complete neglect, or let's say a disregard of other people inside the city. It creates challenges. I mean, it creates structural challenges in the structure of the city, because essentially poor people like to be where work is. Very often, where the work is, when you try and transform it with this very glitzy form of development, is in the central areas of the city, or in other parts that are better well endowed. And typically, you go through cycles of evictions and conflict. And in some senses, even a small trigger, as you've seen just now, the trigger that we saw in Chile is a trigger around, let's say, metropolitan mass transit prices. We saw something like that, very similar, 7 or 8 years ago, which led to a regime change in Brazil around prices in Rio. Similar big demonstrations, I've seen them myself in Sao Paulo. These are expressions of an underlying process. And I think Brazil, for example, responded to the challenge of exclusion, of informalization, etc., more than a decade ago, by, in a sense, institutionalizing the right of the city. The city statute of Brazil actually transformed how poor and vulnerable people could actually integrate themselves into the urban fabric. And in some senses has been the inspiration for a whole range of other processes that have worked in other parts of the world. But as politics changes, and as we've seen in Brazil, many of those processes have actually been undone. So this is a work in progress. These contests are ongoing. We know that there are very serious challenges with unfettered, unregulated, within quotes, capitalism. But capitalism itself sort of morphs itself. And we've seen, like I said when I started, how the contagion from the US housing crisis, the SNL crisis, then infected an entire economy, and in some senses changed the way the world was actually functioning. But on the other hand, at least in my experience, the fact that 2008 happened and a lot of people really suffered across the world was one of the reasons that the SDGs were created. There was a sudden realization that every country in the world, and that's what the SDGs have done, and they've been politically negotiated, that every country in the world is a developing country. If you look at the SDG index, I mean, you folks know this just now. The United States is not at number one or number two. I mean, it is notionally between China and the US as the single largest economy. It sits in the mid 30s in terms of sustainable development. And why is that? Because of inequality. So you can have high productivity, you can have a large economy, but because of the inequality that you see, it manifests itself in many ways, including the politics that we're seeing in many parts of the world, including in North America.
Right. Next question is from Mansi. Shouldn't more efforts be focused on bringing the advantages and aspirations of urbanization to rural areas to try and curb migration? Agriculture is an upcoming big issue with migration from rural. Is migration the root of all of this problem? And if that is sorted out, will majority of challenges of urbanization in cities be resolved then?
This is an old story, and I think we have to unpick. And I thought, we tried to do this in the session that we've done. So there's some parts of the world, especially certain elites and certain people in government and maybe even in the private sector, who see migration as a problem. So the story starts with there are lots of people in the world. There are too many of them for whatever we need to do. We need to protect our cities, and this comes from a mindset in which cities had walls around them. Fine. I mean, you put a wall around the city. We don't have any walls in most places across the world, but now you're putting either a legal wall or you're putting an economic wall because of property rights or a whole range of other things, or lack of access. The fact is that economic development and reduction of poverty and improving of people's lives and urbanization have gone hand in hand. But like I've said earlier, the challenge is, how do you manage the positive sides of urbanization? Job creation, bringing institutions together, making sure that people have access to education, healthcare, and all the basic services, with the other side. Because it's very easy with a relatively small population in a dense area to actually increase exploitation, to make sure that you can institutionalize a whole range of unequal processes as far as that's concerned. So people look at informal settlements as a problem, because they say poor people come into the city, they live in informal settlements, they create a mess. In actual fact, informal settlements are some of the most creative places in the world, because people are trying to survive in this rather harsh environment, which is very unequal, which may not provide them the services which as citizens actually you require to give them, of water, of sanitation, of adequate electricity, of proper education for children, or proper healthcare. Citizens pretty much across the world have equal rights, and they should have equal opportunities. So migration has been looked at as something that we should stop. And one of the ways of doing that, of course, is rural development. That was part of an earlier discourse, which is still rampant in many parts of the world. The other way is by creating smaller urban centers, which become magnets to large metropolitan areas, and trying to develop them. Actually, we have to look at the entire settlement system of a country or a region to try and understand what's actually happening. Because rural areas and villages, and that's why we call Goal 11 sustainable cities and communities, are absolutely central. I mean, where are cities going to get their food from? Where are ecosystem services going to come from? We need our forests, we need our wetlands, we need our marshes. They're all very critical, because that's what keeps ecological services alive. You won't have air, you won't have adequate water without them. Fine. So you need to keep a balance between the so-called rural and the so-called urban. In fact, these categories are 18th century categories, which we still use in many parts of the world, and they have a value in some senses, but are not very useful in a dramatically changing urban landscape. So we have to look at everything from small villages all the way up to larger urban centers, and we have to ask the question, where are we going to get our food from? Where, and that's what the primary sector is about. That's what agriculture and fisheries and whole animal husbandry, etc. are about. And people need to eat, so it needs to come. And how we do that is very critical, not only for employment and improvement of quality of life, but also for questions like climate change. What you choose to use, if you go to a very energy intensive agriculture that produces a lot of methane, that creates a lot of emissions, you have a challenge. And then, of course, we have the secondary sector, which is important because unless we have the steel, the cement, and the electricity, and we have the manufacturing that provide us with things that we need in our daily life, our spectacle and our shoes and our clothes, that comes from the manufacturing sector. Where does that come from? Typically, that comes from cities. But today we have the ability, with the manufacturing revolution working its way out, that we can do many things in smaller places that we could not do earlier. So in the early days, you brought a lot of coal and a lot of workers and a lot of energy into large metropolitan centers. Empires were built on that, typically the British Empire, with these large industrial centers. But today we don't need to do that. We have the ability with decentralized energy, with a whole range of new manufacturing techniques, to decentralize that process. So in some senses, we have a very interesting opportunity. And we'll see that probably being played itself out in South Asia, where instead of having a lot of large metropolitan centers with tens of millions, in some cases 100 million people inside it, you can have the same population in a much more distributed manner, because the technology of the 21st century allows you to do that. Solar PVs, the circular economy, dealing with waste and water at a local level. The entire production and consumption systems have changed, or they will change very quickly. And I think we need to think of urbanization in that context. And the economy also will change. It becomes a much more network-oriented economy, where value is added not at the hubs, at the center, value is added at the nodes, which we're seeing in the gig economy. We're seeing that in a whole range of things and services, but that will permeate itself back into the manufacturing process, and hopefully then into agriculture, because people in rural areas should have the same kind of services. 15 years ago, many of us had worked towards something that was called urban development, where you keep the balance between the two, and we don't actually look at it as a very sharp divide, because many people would be happy to live in urban areas if they have the opportunity to live well, on a decent wage, or they had economic opportunity, they had education and healthcare. Because now with the internet and a whole range of other things, other issues have become much less, there are much less barriers to access to information, or to entertainment and a whole range of other things. So the world is changing, and our city structures have to change too.
Next question is from Sadie. If cities need to be more self sufficient, it places a huge burden and responsibility on local urban bodies, which unfortunately do not always have the level of financial independence required. How does one deal with this conundrum, and perhaps with cases?
Yeah, this is one of the big questions we're going to be addressing at Durban. So I guess look at the UCLG site. I'm not sure how much they'll live stream from there, but this is one of the core questions that we've been dealing with. So the thing is, the 20th century has been situated around nation states. Fine, countries have been central. We've gone through a process of the end of empires, decolonization, and then the emergence of 100 and whatever 93, 200 countries. But within that process of decolonization and development of the nation states in the way that they have just now, and economic development, the one thing that we found is a continuous tussle between national governments and what happens at local level in cities, right? And that comes from a particular view of the centralized state. It comes from Europe, by and large, in the 19th century, where the formation of new nation states was emerging, and essentially what were fairly independent and autonomous cities. In fact, Europe, for example, had a whole history of autonomous cities, and of course, many other parts of the world had a range of these so-called city-states that were functioning even to the 19th century. So the centralizing nation-state took away resources, power, political, economic, and otherwise from the cities, and made them dependent fiscally, because you take away the power to tax, dependent on a whole range of other things, including control through the bureaucracy and law and stuff like that. That is being contested just now. That's why whatever, a few hundred mayors are coming together and saying, look, we have the solutions to a lot of the world's problems. Just let us get on with the job and try and deal with questions of sustainable development. Because in some senses, mayors and local governments are much better placed to deal with these local questions than national governments are. Now, national governments don't like hearing that. So this is obviously a political contest. It's a contest of, who's got primacy, who has power, who has the resource mobilization capacity. So it means who can tax, and who can define what needs to happen. And I would imagine over the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to see a very intense tussle in the space. But what some of us are trying to tell, in a sense, both sides of the story is, look, this is an opportunity for partnership. This is what goal 16 and 17 are all about. But the partnership is not only among countries, it's between national and local governments, because together you can provide the foundations and the framework through which citizens can actually go out and do the work, because eventually it's citizens who matter. It's local enterprises that will make the economic development happen, of course, with people coming in from other parts of the world, or maybe with larger enterprises in place. But if you look at the bulk of the world today, especially the world of emerging urbanism, which is, like I said, largely informal, it is a whole range of small processes that matter. It's not the big things that matter. The big things sound great, and when you're standing in the UN General Assembly and making a speech, it sounds grand. But in actual fact, it's a nitty-gritty of everyday life that's really, really important, and that's where I think the action is going to be. We're going to see a lot of interesting contests there, and I think a lot of the innovation that we're going to be seeing is in these 10,000 places. So the story I try and tell is, look, this is not sustainable development is not the story of 200 countries. It is a story of the partnership between 200 countries and at least 5,000 places, maybe 10,000. And remember, we have 4,000 days to do it. So you've got to turn a place around every, 3 or 4 places a day to be able to get there. And it can't be done without local government. It's impossible.
Right. We have another question on migration from Tanvi. If we avoid migration, we can keep the social fabric intact and develop the rural instead of adding to the chaos of cities. For example, the Reliance industry is set up in Jamnagar. Any thoughts on?
The thing is this. I mean, I have a little bit of an issue with this with this framing. Rural areas are, this is an old. You can go back to Voltaire, go back to Aristotle, a whole range of other people in the Western tradition, and in India, this was a big debate between Gandhi, Nehru, and Ambedkar. Villages are interesting places unless you are part of the underclass. So if you're exploited, or typically if you're a woman, and you have to walk, or with a girl child 4 kilometers a day to get water, life is not very exciting. It's tough. It's difficult. You live a fairly short life. Or if you are somebody of a disadvantaged social community, or in the context of India, since you asked a question about India, you're from a disadvantaged caste background, life is horrible. In fact, that's exactly why Ambedkar, who's the framer of India's constitution, asked people of particular caste backgrounds to come to cities, because in cities at least they had an opportunity of shedding whatever it is, 1,500 to 2,000 years of social ostracization and exploitation. Similar issues, of course, it was done much more radically in China. I mean, part of the Cultural Revolution, which was a really horrible time to live in, was the Chinese regime, and Mao particularly, trying to actually upend and sort of take apart these older structures and processes which are embedded in rural areas. So, it's a nice thing to live in wonderful circumstances. There's always this willingness of people to want to return to nature. But the fact is, we live in a planet where there are almost 8 billion people. We may touch 10, and half of them or more, 5 billion, are going to be living in cities. So we can romanticize rural areas, and we need this. We need places where ecosystems and agriculture and animal husbandry and a whole range of other things can happen, and some of that can happen in cities. But unless we're able to bring the two together and stop sort of creating this binary in our minds, we have a real challenge. Because if there's no binary, if there's a continuum in some senses, then the process of moving from one place to the other is not this grand migration where millions of people are moving from wonderful rural areas to terrible cities, but a set of different choices depending on your circumstance where you want to live in. Because people also have connection to place. People speak particular languages, they like certain food. So the connection to space is not only a rural urban question, it's also a regional question. So I think there the deep questions of culture here that we have to sort of ask wherever it is in the world. And in some senses, the worst thing that you can lose is your culture, and these cultures are emerging.
Um, A follow up on the previous question: can participatory budgeting be a possible solution to the problem of ULB financial dependency?
Partial, yes. And I think, there are many thousand cities across the world that are trying to deal with this question. But I think participatory budgeting, which is a great innovation that's emerged in Latin America, the more useful outcome of that is actually a democratization of the process of decision making in the city. So, we talked earlier about the right to the city and the right to access. What participatory budgeting has done is help create social and cultural structures where citizens have a voice. They have a way of actually engaging with at least a part of their municipal budget, because most cities in the world which use participatory budgeting are not exposing the entire budget to participatory budgeting, because you'll have a whole range of other challenges that are there. Because if you're doing this year's budget, then you can't do long-term infrastructure, a whole range of other things. But even if you take 10-15% of the budget around things that are very sensitive as far as citizens are concerned, let's say healthcare access, or what kind of schools and where the schools will be located, and people can then allocate in a local manner things that make sense to them. It's a question of how you deepen democracy. So I don't think it's going to deal with the fiscal question, because questions of how you do large scale infrastructure, how your land markets are regulated, can't be addressed by participatory budgeting. It's a signaling device, but it's really a means of trying to engage citizens who have become alienated in many parts of the world. We were talking just now about the challenges in Santiago, or the even more dire challenges that are being experienced in Hong Kong and in other places in the world. Or we've seen this happening 7 or 8 or 10 years ago in Cairo. I've seen the same thing happening in Istanbul, etc. There are a whole range of people who are disaffected, or who are affected or concerned, and the current mechanisms of economic development or political engagement don't give them the place to do that. So participatory budgeting is a good way of trying to connect in that missing middle between people's aspirations and capacities and how governance is exercised.
Speaking of citizen participation, Varun, who's an IT engineer, is very much interested in environment, culture, and economics, but does not have a formal education in it. And he would like to know, how could one from such backgrounds actually contribute to this domain or make a career in this domain?
Well, the first thing is you've got to accept that you're a citizen, fine, which means that you live in a place and you care for the place and you can do something for it. Because the whole thing about being a citizen is actually participating in a whole range of democratic processes. First, do you know the people who are engaged in your area that help deal with the solid waste? Do you know who actually manages, who's the political representative that you have in that particular place? Do you know about these things? Many of us are happy to live in a city. We spend a lot of our time on our fancy machines and computers and phones and stuff like that. So part of the thing is stepping out and looking and engaging with people who are trying to do stuff, and connecting with other citizen groups. So I think what we're seeing in many parts of the world is, especially with younger people, is this upsurge of wanting to be able to contribute, wanting to take charge of not only today, but of course the opportunities that people would have in the future. So the whole thing about citizenship is you've got to step out and do it yourself. It's not something you can leave to somebody else. It's your life, it's your city, it's your country. So the more you are able to set up and build solidarity with a whole range of other processes, with your neighbors, with people in the community, the better things are to move forward. But having said that, it's good to come together, but you need to have both voice, which is why we're doing this stuff, but also agency. If you decide to go and improve something or make a change, or ask your city administration to try and help you, you have to understand how to get that voice actually processed and engaged, so that it leads to concrete action and things that can actually make a difference. And that's something that people don't necessarily understand very well, because the city is a complex place. Like we've said, there are many systems. It's a system of systems. So getting to understand what those systems are is very important. So if you're somebody who works in the IT space, who understands systems, you're an interesting person to go out and figure out what's actually happening. But a lot of these systems are about people, they're about institutions. So it's not only about technology, it's not only about economic value or making money, it's about a whole range of other things. So there's a lot of literacy that's got to be gained. And yeah, there are places in the world that teach you about this if you want to learn. but nothing then going out and joining an active citizens group, choosing if you're really brave and willing to put your part of your life down. Why not go into to public service or into politics? That's a great way of making a change. You learn very fast if you decide to become a local politician.
Next question from Bindu. What could be the scope of public private partnership in the case of making informal sector livelihoods into formal employment opportunities?
The frank answer to that, in my experience, and my experience is not too good or not too bad, is public private partnerships do not work for this kind of space. Why? Because there's a huge asymmetry in economic power and relationships between the two sets of entities you're talking about. So own account enterprises, people who are actually producing things in the house, typically, take an example, they're producing t-shirts as part of a supply chain for a large branded garment manufacturer that some of us may actually buy from in a fancy retail place. The power equations between them are very unequal. So public private partnerships are useful for some things, but I have not seen them working very well around questions of economic development. I've seen cooperatives, I've seen social movements, I've seen labor unions actually doing this much more effectively, because it's bringing together people who need to have some basic things that the organized private sector is unable to deal with. There's been a big debate for a long time about this idea of the let's say the gold at the bottom of this sort of so-called pyramid, the trillions of the dollars that could be made or whatever it is at the bottom of the pyramid. And actually, if you look at the medium run, it was an interesting and a useful idea, and a lot of people came together and did stuff from that. I think that the jury is still out on how effective. I mean, there's opportunity, obviously, because people are consumers, they produce things, but a lot of people live at a wafer thin margin in pretty difficult circumstances. And if those circumstances are in urban areas where you don't have basic services, life is tough. So, yeah, I mean, PPPs work for some things. They work for certain forms of infrastructure. In some countries, they work for even the provision of some social services. But economic development, I would be a little skeptical.
Right. Next question from Carlos. Is there enough emphasis on medium and small size cities to promote them as centers of production and consumption? It appears that in every country, only certain megacities take in all the economic opportunities. Do we need better economic policies then?
Of course we do. And this is a big debate. In fact, I mean, within UCLG, we have a special focus there on secondary cities or small and medium cities, because in actual fact, if you look at it, the bulk of the new addition of people of economic opportunities is going to happen in the small places. And why is that so? Because many of the larger metropolitan areas are saturated. So, whether you look at New York or you look at whatever it is, well, Nairobi maybe less, but if you look at places in India or even in China, many of the large metropolitan regions, because of their scale, because of the diseconomies of scale in some senses, because after a certain point of time, a whole range of other processes start taking place. Places become impossible to commute from one region to the other. There are huge environmental challenges. In some cases, if inequality is high, you have a whole range of governance issues. Latin American cities, among others, have serious questions of crime. If you look at many of the large cities in Nigeria, for example, you have many issues in terms of governance and management. So putting it all together becomes very difficult in very large places. So the future, in some senses, is, or at least the future of sustainable development, in some senses, is in small and medium towns. And that there's one set of challenges, and that is that, like you said, you're absolutely right. Resources are often difficult to come through. So firms don't come and invest there. Fiscal resources that come from government are difficult to access, and institutional capacities are often weak. But on the other side, on the other hand, the wonderful thing about small towns, especially ones that are 100,000, 200,000, half a million, which is a big place in some parts of the world, is that you can actually engage, you can solve these problems much faster than you would in a large metropolitan city. There are less vested interests. Things are of the scale that you can make a change. You can mobilize citizens. Economic development becomes so much easier to deal with. And there's actually sometimes more space to do stuff because the cities are small. So it's a lot easier just to manage that scale and size. The challenge for us is to get a whole range of people like yourselves and us to be able to work in smaller places to turn them around quickly. The opportunity is huge, but we have to create the conditions to make that happen. And part of that is changing the mindset, which says, rural areas are good, large metropolitan cities are great, but the migrants who come to them are horrible and they're creating a problem. It's a continuum, and I would say the tip of the balance of this entire system, the fulcrum lies in small and medium towns, and that's where I think the change can be made. And now people have access to knowledge. If you're able to influence the imaginaries of what small and medium towns would look like in every part of the world, we could actually change the lives of billions of people. That's a very interesting um, challenge for us to work on.
So we're nearing the end of the webinar, and so we'll take possibly one or two more questions. And next question is from Mansi. In the current political scenario we are in, people participation and inclusive urbanization seems to be life-threatening. This question is from India. How do you think the RA Forest case could have been tackled differently? Perhaps you could also just give context to our non-Indian learners.
Yeah. So the thing is, in some senses, like we've been saying again, how can you have sustainable urbanization of, without dealing with the concerns that citizens have, right? Now, part of the problem is that we set up things in binaries. So we said rural urban, and one of the other big debates is, are you doing development or you're protecting the environment? Actually, and this is a particular case, there's a new infrastructure that's being built in the city of Mumbai, and that infrastructure, it's a mass transit system, which is actually very important for the city. Needs to have a place for for all the rolling stock to sit in. The only place in an extremely crowded city that they found was in a protected area or on the edge of what would be seen as a protected area. And in order to set up this infrastructure, a large number of trees, which are very important to the city, were cut, legally or illegally, something which the courts will decide. But the challenge is that the city needs both those things, yeah, or it needs more than both those things. It needs a respect for the fact that people who are living far away from where the work is need to go back and forth, so their livelihoods depend on that. In a city that's very long, and where there's a huge amount, the proportion of people living in informal settlements is close to 60%. So you think of a place which has 25 million people, 60% of that is a mega city in itself. They need to move back and forth. For that, you need an infrastructure that actually works. The question, of course, is who's going to give up the space that they have for that infrastructure? Are the rich people going to do it, or are disproportionately the poor people going to do that? Now, one of the big challenges is that citizen activism is also class-based in some senses. Yeah. So what you have here is a number of residents who are saying, "Look, we will not allow you to cut the trees," which is a great thing in itself. But you have to come sometimes to an accommodation where you're able to balance out the interests of the larger metropolitan area and the requirements that are there locally. The challenge, of course, is that when the state apparatus in this particular case says, look, we're going to plant a whole range of other trees in other places, citizens don't actually believe them. And then they'll agitate, and then they'll stop things, and they'll get into conflict. So the question really for us is, we need citizen participation. We need people to step out and assert their rights. We need them to be able to try and go out and make things differently. But we need to focus on the proposition. How are we able to deal with the problem? And part of that is actually engendering a much more active process of urban politics and decision making, of which we heard about participatory budgeting as one end of it, but also much more active engagement and negotiation, because there are multiple interests. There are people who live in gated communities who live a pretty good life, but the fact is that if the water supply that comes to them comes through an informal settlement, and people in the informal settlement get jaundice, or they get whatever it is, a waterborne disease, the people in the gated community are going to get the same thing. So we live together in the same environment. It's critical for us to be able to work together and actually recognize and respect each other and respect the spaces that we're trying to create to make it something that works for everybody. I'm not saying that everything will become equal in even a generation. It may not be very good for that to happen, or it may work in some places and not work in others. But the fact is, we're all living in dense places. There are great opportunities there, but there are great challenges, and you need to balance out those interests and not only think about today and whether my tree was cut down today or I couldn't get to work, but also think about what the options are for the future. And we are actually stealing from our future in many ways, in the way that we're running our urban spaces, which is what is fueling a lot of the discontent in many parts of the world, which we have to address. And it's us. We're part of the process. We're part of the problem. We're part of the solution at the same time.
Right. Thank you so much for your time on this, Aro. I think with this, we'll close the webinar. We've reached our 60-minute limit. And it was a very engaging and informative session. Thank you so much. To our learners, thank you for your participation and engaging questions. We apologize if we couldn't take all your questions. We only have a limited time of 60 minutes. But we encourage you to please participate in the future webinars that are to come. And hope you have a good evening. And we will see you again in the next webinar.
Thanks, and we'll take your questions in whatever way we could. Thanks so much. Bye.